Hi, good morning. In this series, we're going to look at the book of Proverbs together. Today, our study will mainly focus on chapters 8 and 9. Now, before we get into looking at the study, I want to do a few introductory comments. Firstly, why do I think it's worth looking at this book? I would say this, as Christians, we are living in an increasingly secular world where the idea of Christianity as a guide to life is no longer the norm. As Christians, we cannot just follow the way everybody else lives their lives. We have to live a Christ-centered life. In order to do that, we require a godly wisdom. The wisdom not only to make good choices, but also to understand how life works. We need wisdom in our speech, in how we interact with our neighbors, in how we treat strangers, how we see money and wealth, how we see issues like injustice and equality, how we view morality. All of these are questions of wisdom. We also live our lives before effectively the watching world. And the world will not judge us by our theology. It doesn't really care, but it will judge us by our words and our deeds. In this, we need God's wisdom. And this is what this book of Proverbs is trying to give to us. Personally, I found that as I've moved through the different phases of my life, I need wisdom on a continual basis. For example, my life has gone through the phase of having a young child, of rearing younger children, rearing teenage children, and now relating to young adult children. And in each of these phases of life, I need a different wisdom. I need a different perspective on life. Now, in that context, when we look at the opening verses of this book of Proverbs, the author sets out his objectives. So let's just take a look together in chapter 1, verses 2 to 5. I'm reading from the New American Standard. It says this: "To know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel." So you see here that he's outlining the idea that this book is to give wisdom, give understanding, teach us prudence. And if, as all people, we need more wisdom, this is what the book is for. It says a wise man will hear and will increase in his learning. So if we want to learn, this is the book we need, because it gives instruction, wisdom, and justice and equity. Now, in case we think that this book is just about some kind of a head knowledge of life, let's continue down, look at verse 7a. It says this: "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Later on in chapter 9, verse 10, it says this very similar phrase. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." So true wisdom is not just knowing facts or having observations on how the world works. It is seeing these things in the light of who God is and what he has created us for. Another way of looking at this is to say that true wisdom is an understanding life not just with our minds, but also with our hearts. We make value judgments with a combination of our mind and our heart. When our hearts and minds are aligned with God's, then we will have proper perspective. So we need both. We need both instruction for the mind and we need instruction for the heart. And this is what the book of Proverbs will try and address for us. It will try and give us instruction for the heart, for the mind, and give us instruction on what is the will of God, what is the understanding of God, so that again our hearts and minds can be aligned up with God's wisdom. Now, I suppose a question we could ask at this point is, does wisdom want us? We might want wisdom, but does wisdom want us, or does God want us to have wisdom? Again, in the book of James, in chapter 1, verse 5, it says this: "But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him." So here in James, it's very clear that it is the will of God that we receive wisdom. And interestingly, this same invitation to receive wisdom is what we will see in chapters 8 and 9. So what it took in the book of James, one verse, to say Proverbs will take 2 whole chapters to give us the same idea, that God wants us to have wisdom. So let's now take a look at chapters 8 and 9 in the book of Proverbs. Now, to help us understand this section, it's good that we understand the genre of these chapters. In other words, what is the type of literature are we looking at? Now, in chapters 8 and 9, we are basically looking at poetry. Now, when we think, for example, of English poetry, we think of the idea of verses rhyming. In other words, the words sound the same at the end of each verse. In Hebrew, it's not about the verses rhyming, as the idea is what rhymes. In other words, one verse gives an idea and the second verse gives that same idea in another way. So, for example, if we look at the first 3 verses of chapter 8, and we will see this, it opens with, it says, "Does not wisdom call, and understanding lift up her voice?" So again, here we see the idea of wisdom calling, and then the second part of the verse says, "Understanding lifts up her voice." 2 ways of saying to call. "On top of the heights beside the way, where the paths meet, she takes her stand." Again, the idea of a place in both verses. On top of the heights beside the way, where the paths meet. Beside the gates at the opening to the city, at the entrance of the doors, she cries out. Again, it's that same idea. Beside the gates at the opening to the city, parallels with at the entrance of the doors, she cries out. So this is this type of poetry. So again, we need to, when we read it, we've got to remember this is not straight narrative. This is actually poetry, and so it'll follow the same rules as interpreting poetry. Now, the other thing we need to, again, keep in mind here is that while this describes wisdom in chapters 8 and 9, it's using a literary idea called personification. This is where you take an abstract idea and you give it human form. Now, as you explain it as if it's a person. So we don't want to take that analogy too far, but enough to say that wisdom is being portrayed as a woman. Now let's get into reading chapters 8 and 9. And again, we will see a progression in this. So in the first section here, chapter 8, wisdom is calling out to people to listen to her. So again, let's listen to these verses from verse 1. "Does not wisdom call, and understanding lift up her voice? On top of the heights beside the way, where the paths meet, she takes her stand. Beside the gates at the opening to the city, at the entrance of the doors, she cries out." So again, what's described here is that, again, this is like a description of a city. And in those days, the place where people met was at the gates of the city or in the high places. And it describes the idea, I want to use the word of paths, which is like the path of life, the path you take in life, and wisdom intercepts those paths and cries out. So wisdom is crying out to be heard. And what is she crying out? Let's read from verse 4. "To you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of men. O naive ones, discern prudence, and O fools, discern wisdom." So again, she's calling out to men to hear, to listen to her voice. Let's go on in verse 6. "Listen, for I shall speak noble things, and the opening of my lips will produce right things. For my mouth will utter truth, and wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the utterances of my mouth are in righteousness. There is nothing crooked or perverted in them. They are all straightforward to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge." So here wisdom is qualifying the words that she says by saying she says nothing wicked. Everything she says is truth. It's based on righteousness. So you can trust the words that she says. You can trust his wisdom. In verse 10 it says, "Take my instruction and not silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all desirable things cannot compare to her." So here wisdom is claiming that for your life, it's better than silver or gold or precious things. And think about the amount of time and energy we spend in effectively making a living, making money to live. And here wisdom says that finding wisdom is much more precious than that. So it's the idea that if you're going to pursue gold and silver or valued treasures, instead pursue wisdom. In verse 12, she continues on to describe herself. She says, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance, and the evil way, and the perverted mouth I hate. Counsel is mine, and sound wisdom. I am understanding, power is mine. Again, wisdom is describing her qualities. She mentions prudence, knowledge, counsel, understanding, power. All these qualities of wisdom that she says are good to have. Down in verse 17 it says, I love those who love me, and those who diligently seek me will find me. Again, an amazing promise that if you seek wisdom, you will find it. If you diligently seek it, you will find it. She goes on in verse 18, it goes on and says, riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, even fine gold, and my yield and choice is silver. I walk in the way of righteousness in the midst of the paths of justice, to endow those who love me with wealth, that I may fill their treasuries. Again, there's a parallel ideas that she talks about. She will give to those who seek her gold, choice silver. This is what they inherit. But they also inherit righteousness, talks about justice. And again, it's the balance between, again, from God's perspective, that things like justice and wisdom and righteousness, equity, all these things are as valuable as gold and silver, and are probably valued even more so. In verse 22 down to verse 31, it describes wisdom. She describes herself as having been there when creation was formed. The wisdom was an integral part of the whole of creation. So, for example, if we look at verse 30, when it talks about the creation, it says, then I was beside him as a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world, his earth, and having my delight in the sons of men. And this kind of parallels what we see in the Genesis story, where as God created the earth and everything in it, each end of each day he said this was good, and when he created man he said this was very good. And here it's the personification again of wisdom is there at creation, rejoicing in what God has created. Again, understanding that the world and all that God has made, built into that is wisdom. And so when you understand that, you'll understand how wisdom works. She goes on in verse 32, now therefore, O sons, listen to me, for blessed are those who keep my ways. Heed instruction and be wise, and do not neglect it. Again, another encouragement telling us that if we seek wisdom, we will be blessed. It is good for us. Verse 34, it says, blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at my doorposts. For he who finds me finds life, and obtains favor from the Lord. Again, this idea that when we started out with that wisdom cries out, and now it says the one who listens. So it's like the listening gets us drawn in. We hear about wisdom, we decide we want it, and then we start to seek it. And in this one, it's getting more personal in that this person watches daily at her gates, waiting at her doorposts. It's the idea of you going now and seeking wisdom. You're finding the source of wisdom. You're getting near to her house. And again, there's a parallel here in verse 36. It says, but he who sins against me injures himself, and those who hate me love death. So here is the idea that when we don't seek wisdom, when we refuse and walk away from wisdom, we will go down paths which will eventually lead here in this context to death. So again, it's the offer of life or death. And we often find that in the scriptures, God will set out before us a path of life or a path of death. And here wisdom is the same. We have a choice to make. Do we pursue and seek wisdom, or do we just pursue other things? And now we come into chapter 9. And 9, again, when we were talking about the idea that first wisdom called out in the streets, and then that chapter finished with those who will seek her house and her pillars of her house. And now we get a further description where wisdom is actually preparing her house to invite guests in. So all the time, the book is drawing you further and further into wisdom, getting closer and more intimate with wisdom. So let's see in chapter 9 Let's read the first few verses here. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out her 7 pillars. She's prepared her food. She has mixed her wine. She's also set her table. She has sent out her maidens. She calls from the top of the heights of the city. So again, here we see this idea that she's built the house, and the house is described as having 7 pillars. This idea of a huge, like, mansion of a house, and 7 in the Jewish idea would have been completeness. So this is a complete house, a beautiful building. And she's prepared her food. There's nothing left to chance here. She's taken the time to prepare her food. She's also mixed her wine. And again, this is something in the Jewish culture of blending wines together to make a finer wine. She's also set her table. She's set out the table. So this is like a feast. So what wisdom has prepared for those who seek her is not just ad hoc. It is very well put together. It is an enjoyable meal. Again, the idea is this is like you invite a guest to your home and you prepare well for them. So when they arrive in, they know they're being well treated. They are respected and honoured. And this is what wisdom is personified as. She's made this great welcome that she invites us into. And then she sends out her maids to bring people from afar and from the tops of the heights of the city. Again, the same idea. The heights of the city, again, in a Jewish context, would have been the idea of that's where you did your worship. Places of worship were always on the heights of the city. And then it says in verse 4, whoever is naive, let him turn in here. To him who lacks understanding, she says, come, eat of my food and drink of my wine I have mixed. Forsake your folly and live, and proceed in the way of understanding. It's interesting that the people she calls to are those who are foolish and naive, but she still calls them to come in and again eat and drink, have this fellowship with her. Forsake your folly and live, and proceed in the way of understanding. So again, when you embrace wisdom, you grow in wisdom, you grow in understanding. Then if we go down to verse 9, let's go back down to verse 9. It says, give instruction to a wise man and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man and he will increase his learning. Again, it's saying if we are wise, we can still grow wiser still. And if we're righteous, we will increase in learning. Again, you see the two parallels of one is like knowledge, and the other, righteousness, is having a right heart. It's the idea of being in a right, heart and right frame of mind where we can learn. In verse 10, we looked at that earlier. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So again, true knowledge and understanding comes from a knowledge of who God is, understanding of who God is. So this is not earthly wisdom, which is driven by earthly desires and earthly goals. This is a wisdom driven by God's desire. In verse 11 it says, for by me your days will be multiplied and years will be added to you. If you are wise, you are wise for yourself, and if you scoff, you alone will bear it. Again, you have the invitation that says, if you pursue wisdom, it will give you long life. Years of life will be added to you. And you can grow in wisdom. And again, if you reject wisdom, like the scoffer does, the scoffer rejects wisdom, then you bear it yourself. The consequence you will take on yourself. So again, it's very clear that what you want to do is to pursue wisdom. Now, the last few verses of Proverbs 9 introduces us to another person. This is folly, because the opposite of wisdom is always folly, to do the foolish thing. And here it says the following, read it in verse 13. It says, the woman of folly is boisterous. She's naive and knows nothing. And she sits at the doorway of her house on a seat by the high places of the city. Again, we're introduced to another house. Again, it's also in the high places. This is the places of worship. But this is the foolish person, not very well prepared, calling to those who pass by who are making their path straight. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks understanding, she says. Again, it's the same. We had the same up earlier in verse 4. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks understanding, she says. So again, folly, this other woman is calling out to exactly the same people. The people who are walking along the path, and she is asking them to go to her house, where her house is made of folly. And remember, in wisdom built her house, she prepared her food, she mixed her wine. This is what folly has to offer. Stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. So these are like the ill-gotten gains is what she's offering. But it goes on in verse 18. But he does not know that the dead are there, and her guests are in the depths of Sheol. So when you go to the house of folly, the foolish woman's place, the consequence is death, because there is no real meal there. She hasn't prepared anything. Anything she has is stolen, it is taken from somewhere else. Its end is not good. So here we say, to sum up in chapters 8 and 9, we have this woman wisdom calling us to listen to her voice, to take on wisdom, to take on learning and understanding and prudence and knowledge and justice and equity and everything that is good. That is the call. Or we can go to the woman of folly, where there is only folly and death. Again, we have the choice to make. So I'd encourage you, as we go through this study in wisdom, to maybe ask yourself that first question: what do I really want? Do I want wisdom? Do I want that to be a part of my life? Do I want to embrace God's wisdom, not only in my mind, but in my heart as well? Do I want to truly understand how God sees my world and what he would do in my world? Is this what I want? And if this is what we want, then studying the book of Proverbs is probably a good starting point. Thank you.
Oh God, peel back the layers of my heart. I want communion, I want fellowship, I want to be with you where you are. Oh God, peel back the layers of my heart. I want communion, I want fellowship, I want to be with you where you are. I want to be with you, I want to be with you, I want to be with you, Lord. Oh God, peel back the layers of my heart. I want communion, I want fellowship, I want to be with you where you are. I want to be with you, I want to be with you, I want to be with you, Lord.